A promise could start a war or build an empire in the ancient world. This was the power of honor, an invisible force that shaped the first diplomatic relations across the Fertile Crescent. From the river valleys of Mesopotamia to the Kingdom of Egypt, unwritten codes governed how kings negotiated, formed alliances, and resolved their most bitter conflicts. By the end of this journey, you will understand how these ancient principles of trust and reputation laid the foundation for our modern world. We will uncover why an oath sworn to 1,000 gods was more binding than any written contract, and how a single betrayed promise could erase a kingdom from the map. What does it truly mean when a person's word is their only bond? Honor was the invisible currency of kings, a force so powerful it could hold empires together or tear them apart. This was not the vague idea of personal integrity we might think of today. In the ancient Fertile Crescent, honor was a precise and binding social contract. It demanded absolute truthfulness, unwavering loyalty to one's given word, and a constant, vigilant protection of one's reputation in the eyes of both mortals and deities. To break a sworn promise was not just a political misstep, it was a spiritual offense, an act that risked calling down the wrath of 1,000 gods upon your entire kingdom. For a ruler, this code was the ultimate tool of statecraft. His honor was his credibility. It was what made other kings believe his treaties and accept his ambassadors. Without it, his power was an empty threat, his alliances built on sand. To truly grasp how this system of trust operated across vast distances, we must step into the worlds of the first civilizations that wrote these rules into existence. A king's word carved in stone was more than a command, it was a promise to the world. In the bustling cities of Mesopotamia, rulers like Hammurabi of Babylon understood this power intimately. His famous law code, etched onto towering stone pillars for all to see, was a masterstroke of diplomatic signaling. While we remember its stern principle of an eye for an eye, its true purpose extended far beyond settling local disputes. This public declaration was a king's resume, a way to broadcast to every neighboring ruler that he was a man of order, predictability, and unwavering principle. In a landscape of competing city-states, such a reputation was priceless. A king known for adhering to his own written laws would be seen as a reliable partner, one who would honor the terms of a treaty. The code provided a shared language of justice, a predictable scale that could be applied to conflicts between kingdoms as readily as between two farmers. If a border was violated or a trade caravan plundered, the principle of proportionate response offered a clear path to resolution without immediate escalation to war. This transformed law from a domestic tool into the very bedrock of international relations. A ruler's commitment to justice and his public honor became one and the same, inseparable pillars supporting the fragile architecture of diplomacy. But what made these promises truly unbreakable? The answer lies not just in the stone they were written on, but in the heavens they were sworn to. The stone itself was powerless without the heavens watching over it. When two kings made a pact, their most crucial step was to call upon the gods as their divine witnesses. This was not a ceremonial formality, it was the very engine of enforcement. A treaty was a sacred covenant, a spiritual contract underwritten by the most powerful entities imaginable. In Mesopotamia, they would invoke Shamash, the sun god who saw every injustice, or Adad, the storm god whose wrath could shatter cities. A famous peace treaty between the mighty Hittite Empire and Egypt did not rely on mutual goodwill alone. It summoned 1,000 gods from both of their pantheons, listing them by name to stand guard over the agreement. The message was terrifyingly clear: break this oath, and you risk not just the army of your rival, but a celestial punishment beyond any human capacity. Your crops would fail, your rivers would run dry, your lineage would be wiped from the earth. This spiritual leverage was the ultimate deterrent in a world without international police. It meant a king in Anatolia could trust a promise from a pharaoh in Egypt, because both genuinely believed the same cosmic forces held them accountable. Their faith was the invisible chain that bound their word. But how did rulers translate this profound spiritual threat into a tangible, physical ceremony that everyone could see and understand? The signing of a treaty was a dramatic public performance, a piece of political theater where every gesture carried immense weight. To make an agreement unforgettable and unbreakable, rulers employed powerful symbolic acts. One of the most potent was the animal sacrifice ritual. The parties would walk between the two halves of a slaughtered animal, perhaps a donkey or a lamb. This gruesome act was a vivid physical curse. It declared, "Let the one who breaks this oath be torn apart just as this creature has been." The message was not subtle. It transformed the abstract concept of betrayal into a terrifyingly concrete image that no witness could ever forget. But alongside this threat of divine retribution came an offer of sacred kinship. The sharing of a ritual meal or a ceremonial drink was equally profound. Breaking bread together or sharing wine was not merely a polite custom. It forged a bond of fictive brotherhood, a spiritual family tie that theoretically overrode political rivalry. A rival king became, in that moment, your brother, and to betray a brother was to violate one of the most fundamental laws of both man and God. This combination of dire warning and sacred bond made the agreement socially and spiritually binding for everyone present, from the kings themselves to the lowest scribe. And then came the gifts, the exchange of lavish presents: gold from Egypt, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, or fine purple cloth from the Levant, was often misinterpreted by later historians. This was not bribery. These treasures were tangible symbols of respect and mutual obligation. A magnificent gift demonstrated that you valued your new brother highly, and by accepting it, you entered into a cycle of reciprocal generosity that itself became a binding force. The entire ceremony, from the bloody sacrifice to the shared feast, was designed to engage all the senses, making the abstract notion of a promise something that could be seen, heard, smelled, and tasted. This spectacle was the glue that held the words of the treaty fast, but these powerful agreements, once sealed, had to travel across vast and dangerous landscapes. Their journey rested on the shoulders of a very specific kind of person. The royal messenger stood as a living embodiment of his king's own honor. To harm such an envoy was not merely an insult, it was a direct assault on the sovereignty and sacred reputation of the ruler he represented, an act so grave it could shatter peace and justify immediate war. These were not mere couriers, they were carefully selected extensions of the royal will, often chosen from the highest ranks of the nobility or even from the king's own family. These men possessed a rare combination of traits. They needed the eloquence of a poet to deliver complex speeches with perfect precision, the memory of a sage to recall every nuance of a foreign ruler's response, and the unshakable loyalty of a bodyguard to navigate the temptations and pressures of a rival court. A single misremembered phrase or a poorly chosen word could alter the meaning of an entire treaty, turning an offer of alliance into a declaration of hostility. The messenger's journey was a test of nerve and intellect. He would travel across deserts and mountains, carrying his king's word as his only true protection. Upon arrival, he did not simply hand over a scroll. He performed. Standing before a foreign monarch and his entire court, he would deliver his message as a formal oration, speaking in his king's voice with all the prescribed formalities and flourishes. He had to read the room, gauge the mood of his host, and often engage in spontaneous, high-stakes negotiation. His shrewdness in these moments could secure a favorable trade deal or to escalate a brewing conflict. The entire system of long-distance diplomacy hinged on the integrity of this one individual. His safe passage was the most fundamental rule of the ancient international order, a testament to a world where statecraft was intensely, unavoidably personal. This profound reliance on the spoken word meant that the language of diplomacy itself had to be crafted with extraordinary care. A king's letter could begin with a single word that set the tone for peace or war. Brother, in the royal archives of the ancient world, this term was a precise diplomatic instrument used by the pharaohs of Egypt, the great kings of Hatti, and the rulers of Assyria when they wrote to one another. It was not a claim of blood relation or a statement of fondness. It was a formal declaration of equal standing. To call another king your brother was to acknowledge that he was your peer, that his power matched your own, and that your relationship would be guided by the same sacred codes of honor and obligation that governed a family. This linguistic convention framed the chaotic world of international politics within a familiar, manageable social structure. It created an immediate expectation of loyalty, a duty to offer aid in times of famine or invasion, and a commitment to honest negotiation. The refusal to grant this title, however, was a calculated and profound insult. It signaled that you viewed the other ruler as a subordinate, a mere son unworthy of a seat at the table of equals. This was not a minor slight, it was a challenge to their very legitimacy, an act that could unravel years of careful diplomacy. So how did this carefully constructed language of family hold up when real-world ambitions and bitter conflicts put it to the test? The answer lies in the clay tablets that recorded their most tense disagreements. Even in the midst of serious disputes over borders or the fate of fugitive nobles, the language of brotherhood was often meticulously maintained. A letter might begin, "My brother," and then proceed to list a series of grave complaints and perceived betrayals. This was not hypocrisy. It was a strategic insistence on keeping the conversation within the bounds of their shared honor code. By continuing to use the term brother, a king was reminding his counterpart of their mutual obligations, effectively saying, "We have a problem, but we are both honor-bound to resolve it as equals." The framework of family provided a pre-established path for conflict resolution, a way to de-escalate a crisis without immediate recourse to the battlefield. It forced rulers to argue within a structure of reciprocal respect, making the unthinkable act of betrayal that much harder to justify, both to their own people and to the gods who watched over their sworn bonds. The eternal treaty between Egypt and Hatti is not just a historical artifact, it is a blueprint for how bitter enemies can become steadfast allies. After the colossal clash at Kadesh, a battle so massive it failed to produce a clear victor, Pharaoh Rameses II and King Hattusili III faced a simple, brutal truth. Continuing their war was a drain on their treasuries and a constant risk to their thrones. Their solution was a document of breathtaking sophistication. The treaty they crafted went far beyond a simple ceasefire. It established a formal peace, a promise of mutual military assistance if either kingdom was attacked by a third party, and a detailed protocol for the extradition of political fugitives. This last point was crucial, preventing disgruntled nobles from seeking shelter and plotting rebellion in a rival's court. What made this agreement truly revolutionary was its dual nature. We have both the Egyptian and Hittite versions, and they are not mere copies. Each was tailored for a domestic audience, presenting the treaty as a triumphant achievement for their own king. Yet the core commitments were identical. This was diplomacy acknowledging that perception is reality, allowing both rulers to save face while committing to the same practical, peaceful outcomes. But the real genius, the element that made it last for generations, was its spiritual foundation. The treaty was sworn before the entire divine assembly of both Egypt and Hatti. The sun god Ra of Egypt stood alongside the storm god Teshub of the Hatti, with 1,000 other deities listed as witnesses and enforcers. This created a shared, terrifying deterrent. A Hittite king breaking his oath would anger Egyptian gods just as surely as his own, and vice versa. Their faith created a unified field of divine justice that transcended national borders. For decades, this pact held, trade flourished, and the two superpowers of the age maintained a peace that must have seemed impossible to their fathers and grandfathers. It proved that a framework built on codified principles and mutual honor could indeed overcome generations of hatred. Yet this very success story casts a long shadow, forcing us to ask what terrifying consequences awaited those who dared to break such a sacred bond. A king who broke his word did not merely face an army, he faced oblivion. The most immediate and tangible consequence of betraying a sworn oath was, of course, military retaliation. But the true, lasting damage was far more insidious. It was the complete collapse of a ruler's credibility. News of such a dishonor would travel swiftly along trade routes and through the networks of royal messengers, poisoning a king's name in every court from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. Suddenly, the offers of alliance he sent out would be met with cold silence. The generous gifts he offered would be viewed with deep suspicion. Why would any sane ruler enter into a sacred covenant with someone who had already proven they held the gods in contempt? This diplomatic isolation was a death sentence for a kingdom's security and influence. A monarch without trustworthy allies was a monarch standing alone against a world of potential enemies. His power, no matter how great his army, became brittle and fragile. Rival kings were quick to seize this advantage, turning a single act of betrayal into a powerful propaganda tool. They would publicly denounce the oath breaker as unjust, a man who defied the divine order and therefore had no right to rule. This was not just political smearing, it was a direct challenge to his legitimacy, one that could inspire rebellion among his own nobles or common people who feared their king's impiety would bring famine and plague upon them all. The fear of this total reputational collapse, of becoming a pariah king whom no one would trust or aid, was the glue that held the entire international system together. It made keeping one's word a matter of pure, pragmatic survival. This intricate dance of honor and obligation, however, was not confined to grand politics and military pacts. It was the very engine that powered the ancient economy, flowing through every market and along every trade route. A single shipment of Lebanese cedar could speak a language more eloquent than any royal herald. This was the essence of the ancient economy of honor, where gifts were never free. When a pharaoh sent a chest of Nubian gold to the king of Babylon, he was not engaging in casual generosity. He was broadcasting his immense wealth and power, demonstrating an honor so vast he could afford to give it away. The gift itself was a tangible measure of his status. But for the king receiving this treasure, the exchange created an immediate and binding obligation. His honor now demanded a response of equal or greater magnificence. To send a lesser gift in return was a grave insult, a public admission that your kingdom was poorer, weaker, and less honorable than your counterparts. This created a self-perpetuating cycle of reciprocal generosity, a flow of luxury goods that doubled as a flow of prestige and political goodwill. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, ivory from Africa, and fine horses from Anatolia all moved along these channels of calculated gift-giving, binding empires together in a web of mutual obligation that was as strong as any military alliance. But this system had another, more coercive layer. When a smaller kingdom sent tribute to a great power like Assyria, it was participating in the same code, just from a position of weakness. The tribute was not merely a tax, it was a formal, symbolic act that acknowledged the overlord's superior honor and status. In return, the vassal state received the ultimate gift, the continued protection of the great king and the precious autonomy to manage its own internal affairs. This entire economy, from the voluntary exchange of gifts between equals to the obligatory flow of tribute from subordinates, was the primary engine that drove international trade and political alignment in the Bronze Age. The marketplace and the royal court were one and the same, but if this code of honor governed the grand exchanges between kings, how did it function for the ordinary merchants and diplomats who carried these precious goods across the known world? A merchant's caravan was a mobile embassy, and his ledger a potential peace treaty or a declaration of war. These traders journeying between empires did not operate in a lawless void. Their very presence in a foreign city was often protected by formal agreements between their king and the local ruler. A merchant from Assyria selling his tin and textiles in Anatolia was not just a private businessman. He was a beneficiary of a diplomatic pact, a living symbol of the honor existing between two powers. To cheat him, rob him, or harm him was to insult the king who guaranteed his safe passage. This system allowed commerce to flow across a landscape of competing kingdoms, because everyone understood that a single act of piracy against a merchant caravan could shatter a hard-won peace. But how could a merchant in the city of Canish trust a partner hundreds of miles away to deliver a payment or a shipment of goods on credit? There were no international courts to sue in, no global police to enforce a contract. The answer lay in a weapon more powerful than any legal decree, the threat of total reputational ruin. A merchant's honesty was his single most valuable possession. If he gained a reputation for swindling his partners or defaulting on his debts, the news would travel fast through the tightly knit merchant guilds. He would find himself blacklisted, unable to secure credit, form new partnerships, or even find a caravan willing to carry his goods. In this world, a broken promise meant economic death. The Assyrian trade colonies established across Anatolia are a stunning testament to this system in action. These were not just outposts for buying and selling, they were self-governing communities that operated under their own recognized commercial laws. Disputes between Assyrian merchants were settled by their own councils, based on shared principles of fairness and the absolute sanctity of a sworn agreement. This entire network, which funneled vast wealth for centuries, was built not on force, but on a foundation of mutual trust that was a direct extension of the diplomatic honor codes practiced by kings. The merchant's word was his bond, because his bond was the only thing that allowed him to trade at all. This intricate web of honor, however, extended far beyond the realms of kings and merchants, reaching into the very heart of the royal household itself. A royal daughter was a living treaty, her life a constant measure of her father's honor. Across the ancient world, the diplomatic marriage was one of the most potent and personal applications of the honor code. A king sending his daughter to a foreign court was not merely arranging a political match, he was offering the most valuable pledge of good faith he possessed, a human guarantee of his commitment to the alliance. The princess herself became the physical embodiment of the oath sworn between two rulers. Her well-being in her new home was therefore a matter of intense diplomatic scrutiny. If she was treated with respect, granted influence, and most importantly, if she bore a son who might one day inherit the throne, the alliance was considered strong and healthy. Her success cemented the two dynasties together with bonds of blood, making the sacred codes of family honor directly applicable to international politics. A king was far less likely to attack a nation where his own grandchildren were in the royal line. But if the princess was neglected, insulted, or mistreated, it was not a private tragedy, it was a catastrophic diplomatic incident. Such an act was a direct and public contempt for her father's honor, a violation of the kinship bond that could instantly justify hostility. The famous correspondence of Princess Tushratta of Mitanni, who was sent to marry the Egyptian pharaoh, reveals this intricate web of obligation. Her letters home were not just personal missives, they were diplomatic cables reporting on her status and reinforcing the ongoing demands for the gold and gifts that her father expected as part of the marital agreement. Her very presence in the Egyptian court created a permanent channel of communication and a powerful incentive for peace. This practice made diplomacy deeply, unavoidably relational. It transformed abstract state interests into the intensely personal concerns of family legacy and royal bloodlines. But when these personal bonds of honor were broken and words failed, the same ancient codes would then dictate how kings conducted the brutal business of war. A city that surrendered without a fight could save itself from utter ruin. This was a fundamental principle of warfare in the ancient world, a stark choice offered by the codes of honor that governed even the chaos of battle. Before the first siege tower was built, a formal challenge or declaration of war was often issued, framing the conflict not as a surprise attack but as a legitimate, almost judicial contest between two honorable parties. Once the fighting began, these codes created surprising pockets of restraint. The capture of a high-ranking enemy, a prince or a general, was not necessarily a death sentence. Such a man was often seen as more valuable alive than dead. He could be held for a massive ransom, a transaction that enriched the victor while avoiding the spiritual pollution of killing a nobleman who was in a sense a peer. This practice acknowledged a shared elite status that transcended temporary warfare. The ultimate test of these conventions came at the moment of a city's defeat. A garrison that fought to the last man, forcing a costly and bloody assault, could expect no mercy. Its destruction served as a brutal lesson to others. But a city that negotiated a surrender, that opened its gates and submitted, was frequently spared the worst horrors of sack and slaughter. Its people might be enslaved and its treasures taken, but its walls and temples were often left standing. Why show such restraint? The answer was deeply pragmatic. A reputation for honoring these surrender terms was a powerful strategic asset. Other cities in your path, hearing of your mercy, would be more likely to yield without a fight, saving you time, soldiers, and resources. Furthermore, in the ever-shifting political landscape, today's defeated enemy could be tomorrow's necessary ally. A king known for his ruthless brutality would find it impossible to forge new partnerships, while one known for his honorable conduct, even in victory, kept his diplomatic options open. These were the ancient roots of what we now call rules of engagement, a system designed to inject a thread of predictability into the fabric of war. But how were these complex and unwritten rules transmitted across generations, ensuring that every commander and soldier understood the expectations of honorable combat? A king's victory was not complete until it was carved in stone for all eternity. These monuments were far more than records. They were the ultimate tool for shaping reality itself. After the climactic battle of Kadesh, Pharaoh Ramesses II commissioned grand reliefs on the walls of his temples at Abu Simbel and Karnak. These carvings did not depict a stalemate. They showed a single, glorious Egyptian triumph, with Ramesses portrayed as a giant, single-handedly crushing the Hittite hordes. This was not a lie in the modern sense. It was a statement of divine truth as the king demanded it be remembered. The monument declared his honor upheld, his might unquestionable, and his cause righteous in the eyes of the gods. It was a message for his people, his rivals, and for the future, ensuring that his version of events would outlive him and become the accepted history. The same impulse drove the public display of treaties. The famous Eternal Treaty between Egypt and Hatti was not filed away in a secret archive. Copies were inscribed on silver tablets and placed at the feet of the gods in the major temples of both empires. This act made the agreement a permanent part of the cosmic order, a sacred text that could be consulted by priests and, on occasion, even viewed by elite visitors. By placing it in the temple, the kings were doing more than just storing it safely. They were submitting their human pact to eternal divine scrutiny, making it exponentially harder for a future ruler to casually renounce its terms. To break a treaty displayed before the gods was to invite a curse not just on oneself, but on one's entire civilization. The written word, therefore, became the unblinking guardian of a king's honor. It created an unchangeable anchor point in the fluid world of politics. A rival could not later deny a concession he had made if it was literally set in stone for his own advisors and successors to see. This permanent record turned fleeting spoken promises into a binding historical legacy. It forced a long-term perspective onto rulers who might otherwise be tempted by short-term betrayal. But for all the power of these public declarations, every king knew that the truth behind the polished stone could be far more complicated. This is where the system's shadow counterpart emerged, a world of whispers and stolen glances that operated just beneath the gleaming surface of honor and oath. The gleaming monuments and public oaths told only half the story. Beneath the surface of brotherhood and sacred vows, a shadow war of intelligence and deception was always being waged. Spies moved like ghosts through the corridors of foreign palaces, their mission to uncover the truths a king would never declare in a formal letter. They sought details on the size of an army, the health of that year's grain harvest, and most importantly, the shifting loyalties of a rival's courtiers. Knowledge of a discontented noble or a weak heir was a weapon more valuable than 1,000 chariots. Yet this entire underworld of espionage existed in a constant, delicate tension with the public code of honor. To be exposed in a dishonorable act of subversion was a catastrophic blow to a king's credibility, potentially undoing years of careful diplomatic work. For this reason, deniability was everything. Acts of deception were masterfully crafted to technically adhere to the letter of an agreement while gutting its spirit. A king might withdraw his main forces from a border region as promised, but leave behind elite units disguised as local militia. He could swear to cease hostilities while secretly funding a rebel faction within his rival's own court. This was the cunning of ancient statecraft, a recognition that the honor system was less a set of moral commandments and more a flexible framework for competition. It was a complex game where the appearance of honor was often as strategically vital as its genuine practice. This fundamental duality, this dance between light and shadow, finds its ultimate expression in the methods of one of history's most formidable empires. The Assyrian palace reliefs show a world of absolute power where kings hunt lions and enemies beg for mercy. This was not mere propaganda of strength, it was the visual language of a meticulously calculated system. The Neo-Assyrian Empire mastered a chilling duality, pairing raw terror with a rigid adherence to the ancient codes of honor. They did not discard the diplomatic rulebook, they rewrote it to serve an unchallengeable imperial will. At the heart of their control was the Adair, a formal oath of loyalty sworn by every vassal king to the Assyrian monarch and his supreme god, Ashur. This was not a suggestion, it was a contract. The terms were starkly simple. A vassal who upheld his oath, who paid his tribute on time and offered military support when called, was guaranteed his throne, his lands, and the protection of the Assyrian war machine. His autonomy was purchased with his loyalty, but the moment he broke that sacred vow, the entire framework of honor was instantly flipped. His betrayal was no longer just a political act, it was a sacrilege, an offense against Ashur that fully justified the most extreme retribution. The infamous reliefs depicting flaying, impalement, and the forced exile of entire populations were not just records of punishment, they were public service announcements carved in stone. They served as a ghastly reminder of the explicit consequences written into the Adair Agreement itself. The Assyrians had weaponized the honor code. For a subject state, the choice was terrifyingly clear. You could live in peace under the umbrella of Assyrian honor, or you could defy it and be erased in a spectacle of divinely sanctioned violence. This system allowed a relatively small core of Assyrian administrators to control a vast, multi-ethnic empire for centuries. Their success proved that the principles of oath and consequence could be scaled into an engine of pure domination, where the fear of divine and royal wrath became the primary tool of control. This brutal efficiency, however, was just one interpretation of the ancient rules. Now, let's travel to the other end of the Crescent, to a civilization that built its power not on public terror, but on an almost obsessive secrecy. For a king in Ugarit, a single broken promise could mean the end of his dynasty. This was the precarious reality of the Levant, a crowded corridor of petty kingdoms squeezed between the titans of Egypt and Hatti. Here, in a landscape of bustling ports and fortified hilltops, city-states like Byblos and Tyre practiced a form of diplomacy that was intensely personal and perpetually urgent. Their survival depended not on massive armies, but on a meticulously cultivated reputation for reliability. A city known to honor its treaties became a valuable node in the regional network, a desirable ally whose loyalty was worth defending. Conversely, a ruler who gained a reputation for treachery would quickly find himself isolated, his pleas for help going unanswered as larger empires carved up his lands. The honor code was their primary shield, a way to project a strength they did not always physically possess. This created a constant, frantic dance of alliance building. Kings engaged in a non-stop exchange of gifts and diplomatic marriages, weaving a fragile web of mutual obligation meant to deter aggression from their equally ambitious neighbors. Yet, for all their intricate local politics, their ultimate survival often hinged on the favor of a distant great power. The desperate letters sent from these Canaanite rulers to the Egyptian pharaoh, preserved in the Amarna archives, reveal this strategy in heartbreaking detail. Their correspondence is a masterclass in the performance of loyalty. They address the pharaoh as their lord, their son, and their god, proclaiming unwavering devotion. But these professions of fealty are almost always paired with venomous accusations against rival city-states, detailing every perceived act of dishonor and betrayal. My lord should know that the ruler of Shechem is conspiring with the Habaru, one king writes, and has broken his oath to you. This was more than mere tattling, it was a calculated move within the honor system. By publicly exposing a rival's faithlessness, a king bolstered his own image as the pharaoh's one truly loyal servant, thereby justifying his request for Egyptian troops or gold. Their entire political existence was a high-wire act, balancing local rivalries with imperial loyalties, all while ensuring their own word remained their most unassailable asset. The intellectual energy required to maintain this system was immense, pointing toward a deeper, more philosophical question that would eventually be asked in the very heart of this turbulent region. A king's library held more than records of conquest, it contained the very philosophy of power. tucked away on clay tablets and papyrus scrolls, were works of wisdom literature, the quiet mentors that taught rulers how to think, not just what to do. These texts, like Egypt's instructions of Amenemop or Mesopotamia's counsels of wisdom, framed honor not as a vague ideal, but as a practical roadmap to a successful life. They taught that truthfulness, justice, and self-control were the surest paths to prosperity and social harmony. Their core message was starkly simple: a good name, a reputation for integrity, was a person's most valuable and lasting possession, outliving even grand monuments. To lose your honor was to lose everything of true worth. This philosophical tradition was the bedrock of elite education. Every scribe training to draft a treaty, every diplomat learning his speeches, every prince being groomed for the throne internalized these principles. They were taught that cleverness without ethics was folly, and that power without restraint was a kingdom built on sand. Diplomacy, therefore, became a form of applied philosophy. The abstract virtues praised in the wisdom texts were the same qualities tested every time a king negotiated a border, received an ambassador, or debated whether to honor a decades-old alliance. The quiet wisdom of the scribe directly guided the decisive actions of the king. These ancient principles did not remain static, however. They traveled, they were translated, and they slowly seeped into the foundational texts of cultures that would one day inherit the world. The great kingdoms of the Bronze Age were bound by oaths, but the sky itself seemed to turn against them. Around 1200 BC, a perfect storm of calamities descended upon the Fertile Crescent. A sudden, severe shift in climate brought prolonged drought and famine. Mysterious groups referred to in Egyptian inscriptions as the Sea Peoples raided coastlines with terrifying force. Internal rebellions and the catastrophic breakdown of long-distance trade networks created a domino effect of failure. This was the Bronze Age collapse, a civilizational earthquake that would become the ultimate test for the intricate system of diplomatic honor. The sacred bonds of brotherhood between kings, so carefully maintained for centuries, now faced pressures they were never designed to withstand. When a Hittite king, his own granaries empty from famine, received a desperate plea for grain from his ally in Ugarit, the old obligations meant little. The Hittite Empire was disintegrating, its central authority crumbling. The letter from Ugarit, one of the last ever sent, is a heartbreaking relic of this breakdown. "Our food is gone," it reads. "The enemy's ships are already here. If you do not send help, we will perish." No help came. The system did not fail because the kings suddenly became dishonorable. It failed because the material and spiritual foundations that made honor possible had vanished. How could you fulfill your oath to protect an ally when your own army was starving? How could you trust the word of a brother king when his entire kingdom was being swallowed by fire and chaos? The networks of trust, built on generations of reciprocity, snapped under the weight of existential crisis. The great powers who had once exchanged lavish gifts and royal brides were now fighting for their own survival, their focus turning inward as the international order they had built dissolved around them. Yet something crucial survived the fire. The memory of the code did not disappear with the palaces that stored its treaties. In the smaller, fledgling kingdoms of the subsequent Iron Age, the old principles re-emerged as a blueprint for a new beginning. The rulers of city-states like Damascus and Jerusalem, and the new rising power of Assyria, inherited the fragments of this diplomatic language. They remembered that stability had once been built on a framework of sworn oaths and predictable conduct between rulers. The concept that a king's word was his bond, that treaties required divine witnesses, and that diplomacy operated within a familial framework of brothers and sons, these were not invented anew. They were rediscovered, repurposed from the ashes of the old world. The collapse did not prove the honor system was a fantasy. Instead, it demonstrated that this system was a luxury of stability, a magnificent but fragile architecture that required a functioning world to support it. Its astonishing resilience, its re-emergence from the wreckage, points to a profound truth. These ancient societies, even after experiencing total failure, instinctively reached for the same tools to rebuild. They understood on some fundamental level that without a shared code of honor, there could be no lasting peace, no trust, and no civilization at all. The story of a people and their God was written in the language of empires and kings. When the ancient Israelites described their covenant with Yahweh, they did so using the precise legal and diplomatic framework of their time. This bond was not a vague spiritual promise. It was structured exactly like a Hittite suzerainty treaty. These were the agreements a great king imposed on a lesser vassal, and the biblical covenant mirrors them point for point. It begins by identifying the sovereign, "I am the Lord your God." It then lists the historical context of the relationship, "who brought you out of the land of Egypt." This is followed by the stipulations, the detailed laws the vassal must obey, and finally, it concludes with a stark list of blessings for obedience and catastrophic curses for betrayal. The entire relationship was framed within the same honor-based system that governed diplomacy across the Fertile Crescent. Loyalty to the covenant was the ultimate measure of a king's honor, and breaking it was a geopolitical disaster in the eyes of God. This concept of covenant loyalty, or hesed, became the central pillar of Israelite thought. It was the unwavering faithfulness that was expected in both human relationships and the divine bond, a direct parallel to the loyalty oaths sworn between ancient kings. We see this code in action throughout the stories of the monarchy. King David's rise to power is a masterclass in ancient statecraft. He forms a sacred covenant of friendship with Jonathan, an alliance that transcends politics and binds their souls. As a ruler, he negotiates with neighboring kings, and his son Solomon secures his reign and expands his influence through a series of strategic diplomatic marriages to foreign princesses. He exchanges letters with the Phoenician king Hiram of Tyre, engaging in the classic gift economy of the ancient world to secure the cedar and skilled labor needed to build the Great Temple in Jerusalem. These were not isolated incidents. They were the standard operating procedures for any king who wished to be taken seriously on the international stage. The prophets who stood before these kings served as the conscience of the covenant, their voices echoing the role of royal advisors from Mesopotamia. When the prophet Nathan confronted David over his betrayal of Uriah, he was not just making a moral point. He was charging the king with a fundamental violation of his royal covenant, an act of dishonor that shattered his integrity and jeopardized the nation's standing with God. The prophets Isaiah and Jeremiah constantly judged the kings of Israel and Judah on their foreign alliances, condemning treaties with Egypt or Assyria not merely as political errors, but as acts of faithlessness against their primary covenant with Yahweh. In their eyes, seeking protection from a foreign army was the ultimate dishonor, a betrayal of the one true suzerain. This absorption and transformation of ancient diplomatic culture created a powerful new legacy. The idea of a binding covenant based on ethical conduct and loyalty, once carved on tablets between kings, was now inscribed on the heart of a nation. It laid the philosophical groundwork for concepts of moral law and social contract that would resonate for millennia. But how do we move from these powerful texts to tangible proof? How do we find the physical echoes of these oaths in the dust of forgotten cities? A cracked clay tablet can whisper the words of a 3,000-year-old promise. In the royal archives of the Hattusa, the Hittite capital, archaeologists unearthed the very silver tablet mentioned in correspondence. a tangible copy of the eternal treaty with Egypt. Holding such an object is like touching the agreement itself. These are not abstract historical concepts. They are the filed paperwork of empires, complete with the formal language of brotherhood and the dire curses meant to enforce it. Equally revealing are the Amarna letters, a cache of clay tablets found in Egypt. This was the pharaoh's diplomatic inbox, filled with messages from foreign kings, some groveling for gold, others complaining bitterly about the poor quality of the gifts they had received. You can read the frustration in the cuneiform, a king from Babylon writing, "You have sent me 20 pounds of gold that looks like it was melted down in a kitchen pot." This was not a trivial complaint. It was a serious charge of dishonor, a violation of the gift-giving code that threatened to destabilize their entire relationship. These tablets prove that the language of honor was not just for grand public treaties. It was the daily currency of international relations, governing everything from military alliances to the proper exchange of luxury goods. But how could a king in Mesopotamia trust that a letter from Egypt was authentic and had not been read by spies along the way? The answer is found in a small, intricately carved stone object, the cylinder seal. This was the ancient world's signature and encryption system combined. Each ruler and high official possessed a unique seal, often bearing their name and symbolic imagery, which they would roll across the soft clay of a tablet before it was fired. The resulting impression authenticated the document, and any break in the seal's pattern indicated the message had been tampered with. To possess another king's seal was to hold a piece of his honor, which is why these objects were guarded so fiercely. The seal was a physical extension of the ruler's word, and its impression was a silent vow that the contents were true. A broken seal meant a broken trust, an act that could invalidate an entire agreement. Yet for all the oaths and sealed documents, the landscape itself tells a story of deep-seated fear. The colossal stone foundations of city walls at places like Megiddo and Carchemish are monuments to this paranoia. These were not just defenses against invasion, they were a king's insurance policy against a neighbor's potential betrayal. You can stand today before the massive, sloping ramparts of Hattusa and feel the sheer scale of the investment in security. Building and maintaining such fortifications consumed vast resources, a constant drain on a kingdom's treasury that they would have gladly avoided if they could have truly, completely trusted the oaths of their so-called brothers. The very existence of these walls is proof that the honor system, while powerful, had its limits. Every ruler knew that a treaty was only as strong as the perceived consequences for breaking it, and sometimes the only consequence you could truly rely on was the strength of your own defenses. The final pieces of evidence are the beautiful, silent travelers' luxury goods found impossibly far from home. A piece of Baltic amber formed in the cold northern forests, discovered in a lavish tomb in Mycenaean Greece. Deep blue lapis lazuli, mined from a single remote valley in Afghanistan, set into the golden funeral mask of an Egyptian pharaoh. These objects did not magically appear there. Each one was a link in a chain of honor, passed from hand to hand through formal gift exchanges and tribute payments. They are the archaeological proof of the economy of prestige, a single piece of jewelry representing a web of obligations that stretched across continents. These artifacts make the abstract concept of diplomatic honor suddenly, beautifully concrete. They are the glittering fossils of a world where a king's word was a treasure, and his trust was the most valuable currency of all. A king's promise could travel no further than the skills of the men who carried it. Behind every grand declaration of brotherhood and every treaty sworn to the gods stood an entire class of professionals, the unsung human machinery of ancient diplomacy. At the very foundation was the scribe, His task was far more than simple transcription. He was a master of Akkadian, the common language of international affairs, and he understood the precise, formal phrasing that could turn a simple request into a respectful petition or a veiled threat. A scribe drafting a letter for his king had to choose every word with the care of a jeweler setting a precious stone. He knew that the opening formula, the specific titles used, and even the length of the flattering introductions all carried deep political meaning. A single misplaced cuneiform wedge could alter the tone of an entire message, potentially insulting a sensitive ally. Then came the interpreter, a figure whose role was even more delicate. He did not merely translate words, he bridged entire worlds of culture. He had to find a way to explain the Egyptian concept of Mot, or divine order, to a Hittite official, or convey the Mesopotamian idea of divine wrath in terms a Canaanite king would understand. His job was to ensure that the spirit of the message, its nuance and its honor, survived the journey from one language to another. A literal translation was useless if it failed to communicate the intended respect or gravity. And finally, there was the emissary himself, the man who undertook the long and perilous journey. He memorized the core of his king's message, ready to deliver it with perfect oratorical flair, even if the physical tablet was lost or stolen. His journey was a test of endurance and diplomacy in itself. He had to navigate foreign courts, often waiting for days or weeks for an audience, all while subtly gathering intelligence on the mood of the palace, the strength of the army, and the loyalties of the courtiers. His personal conduct was a direct reflection of his master's honor. Any lapse in his manners, any hint of greed or deceit, could poison the negotiations before they even began. The entire magnificent system of oaths and alliances, for all its divine sanctions, rested on the shoulders of these individuals. Their loyalty, their sharp minds, and their unwavering integrity were the fragile threads that held empires together. But for their work to have any lasting power, it needed to be accepted by a force far greater than any single king. The crowd's roar was the final seal upon the treaty. When two kings swore an oath before their assembled people, they were doing more than just performing a ritual. They were weaving the entire society into the fabric of the agreement. A public ceremony in the main temple courtyard or the city square transformed a private deal between rulers into a shared communal vow. Every merchant, soldier, and farmer who witnessed the event became a living record keeper. They carried the memory of that sacred promise back to their homes and workshops, telling their children about the day their king swore peace with the Hittites or pledged alliance with Babylon. This created a powerful social memory, an unofficial archive that existed long after the clay tablet was stored away. The people now had a direct stake in their king's honor. If he later tried to betray that publicly sworn oath, he would face not only the wrath of foreign gods but the fear and resistance of his own subjects. Why would a farmer risk his fields being cursed by a storm god because his king was deceitful? Why would a mother pray for a ruler whose treachery might bring plague upon her children? This deep-seated public anxiety over divine retribution acted as a powerful brake on royal ambition. A king contemplating a betrayal had to weigh the political gain against the very real possibility of losing the loyalty and morale of the population he ruled. The wisdom of the streets passed down through popular songs and common proverbs constantly reinforced this code. A Mesopotamian saying warned that a liar's barley will not flourish. An Egyptian proverb declared that a good name is all a man truly leaves behind. These were not just quaint phrases, they were the moral compass of an entire culture, repeated in marketplaces and sung at festivals, reminding everyone from the pharaoh down to the potter that a broken word brought shame and ruin. The people, in their collective heart, became the ultimate guardians of the king's honor. They held him to the same standard of truthfulness they were expected to uphold in their own daily lives. This profound connection between state diplomacy and popular morality gave the entire system a stability that no royal decree could ever achieve alone. A desperate king's plea for grain was a test of honor written in hunger. When the rains failed and the fields of Canaan or Anatolia cracked under the sun, the diplomatic language of brotherhood took on a life-or-death urgency. A city-state facing starvation had one primary defense: the strength of its alliances and the honor of its powerful friends. Letters etched onto clay tablets became cries for help, sent down the coast to the one kingdom that usually had grain to spare, Egypt. Thanks to the predictable, life-giving floods of the Nile, the pharaohs often sat on vast stockpiles of surplus grain. A request for aid was not a simple begging letter. It was a formal appeal based on the sacred obligations of their relationship. The petitioner would remind the pharaoh of their past loyalty, of the tribute they had sent, of the treaties they had sworn to the same gods. They were calling in a cosmic debt. For the Egyptian king, the decision was a stark measure of his own honor. Sending shiploads of grain to a starving ally was a magnificent display of power and reliability. It proved he was a true brother, a ruler who honored his commitments even when it was costly. This generosity was an investment that paid immense dividends in loyalty and geopolitical influence. But refusing such a request, turning away a brother in his most vulnerable moment, was an act of profound dishonor. It was a public declaration that your word was worthless when put to the test. The news would spread, and other allies would question the value of their own treaties. In the brutal calculus of ancient survival, a reputation for stinginess during a famine was a king's swiftest path to diplomatic isolation. This reveals the honor code's deeply practical heart. It was not merely a spiritual ideal, it was a sophisticated social technology for managing risk across a fragile landscape. The entire Fertile Crescent was a patchwork of different climates and resources. One region's drought could be offset by another region's bounty, but only if a framework of trust allowed that bounty to be shared. The honor system created the necessary channels for this redistribution. It transformed a simple transaction of grain for future loyalty into a sacred renewal of a bond. In a world perpetually balanced on the edge of scarcity, a king's honor was not an abstract virtue. It was his most vital strategic reserve, a stockpile of trust that could feed his people when the rains did not come. The language of brotherhood could not survive the march of imperial armies, as vast empires like Assyria, Persia, and later Rome absorbed the patchwork of smaller kingdoms. The very definition of diplomatic honor was reshaped for a new age of centralized power. The delicate dance between equals, the exchange of gifts between brothers, was replaced by the stark relationship between a sovereign and his subjects. In this new world, honor was no longer about reciprocal trust between peers. It was redefined as absolute loyalty to the emperor. A vassal king now swore an oath of fealty not to a brother, but to a master, a single supreme ruler whose authority was considered divinely ordained. The entire framework became rigidly hierarchical, a pyramid of power with one man at its apex. Yet, for all this dramatic change, the core principles of the ancient code refused to die. The oath itself remained a sacred covenant sworn before the gods of the empire. Betrayal of that oath was still considered a spiritual crime, punishable by both divine wrath and the emperor's overwhelming military force. And the ruler, in turn, was still expected to act with a form of honor, a concept of justice and protection towards those who submitted to his will. A Persian king was celebrated not just for his conquests, but for his wisdom and his role as a lawgiver, maintaining order throughout his diverse domain. This was the great adaptation. The system shed its skin of equality but kept its bones, the fundamental idea that power, no matter how absolute, required legitimization through a recognized code of conduct. An empire could command obedience through fear, but it governed most effectively when it also cultivated loyalty through a predictable, honorable administration. The old ways did not vanish, they simply scaled up, proving their resilience by providing the essential glue for the first truly global superpowers. This transformation from a network of promises into a hierarchy of command reveals the deepest strength of these ancient principles, their astonishing ability to bend without breaking, to serve kings and emperors alike in the endless human quest for order. A nation's signature on a modern treaty is still a sacred vow. That ancient principle, pacta sunt servanda, is the bedrock of international law today. It is a Latin phrase meaning agreements must be kept. This is not a new idea born in a European conference hall. It is the direct descendant of the oaths sworn before Ra and Teshub 3,000 years ago. The core belief is identical. A promise between sovereign powers creates a binding obligation that transcends temporary political advantage. When countries sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty or the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, they are engaging in the same essential act as Ramesses and Hattusili, staking their national honor on a written commitment. The enforcement mechanisms may have shifted from divine curses to international courts and economic sanctions, but the fundamental goal is unchanged: to create a predictable and stable world where words have weight. This enduring legacy is also visible in the person of the ambassador. A modern diplomat enjoying immunity from local prosecution is the direct heir of the inviolable royal messenger. His protected status is not a personal privilege. It is a formal recognition that he embodies the sovereignty and honor of the nation he represents. To arrest or harm an ambassador is still considered an act of aggression, a profound breach of the unwritten rules that allow for dialogue between states. Just as a Hittite envoy could travel safely into Egypt at the height of their rivalry, a Russian and American ambassador can meet in a neutral capital today, their persons protected by a code that is far older than their governments. This continuity reveals a profound truth about power. A nation's most valuable asset is not merely its military or its wealth, but its reputation for reliability. In the 21st century, we call this credibility or soft power. In the Bronze Age, it was simply a king's honor. The calculation is the same. A country known for breaking its treaties, for reneging on its debts, or for lying to its allies will find itself isolated, its promises meaningless, and its influence withered. It becomes the pariah state, the modern equivalent of the oath-breaker king whose name was cursed in every court. Why do nations still invest immense effort in diplomatic ceremonies, in state dinners, and in the precise wording of joint communiques? These are the modern equivalents of the ritual meal and the gift exchange. They are performances of respect and mutual recognition designed to build the personal trust necessary for larger agreements. The world stage may be larger and the technology faster, but the human heart of the matter remains. We are still trying to solve the same ancient puzzle: how to build trust between independent actors in a system where no single power is ultimately in charge. Our global institutions are attempts to create a permanent, neutral witness, a substitute for the assembly of gods that once watched over the oaths of kings. When we understand this long arc, our modern headlines come into a sharper, deeper focus. The struggles we see today over alliances, trade deals, and international law are not entirely new conflicts. They are the latest chapter in humanity's oldest story, the endless effort to forge order from chaos using the most powerful tool we have ever devised, our pledged word. Our journey ends where civilization began, in the fertile river valleys where honor was the first and most vital treaty. We have walked with the messengers, broken bread with kings, and traced the words of oaths carved in stone. From the public justice of Hammurabi's code to the intricate brotherhood of the Kadesh Treaty, a sophisticated system of honor was the invisible architecture supporting the ancient world. This was not a simple moral code, but a complex social technology that balanced raw power with enduring principle. A king's personal reputation was inextricably linked to his kingdom's security, making his word a matter of survival. This framework transformed unpredictable rivalries into relationships with rules, offering a precious measure of trust across a volatile landscape. Though promises were sometimes broken, the ideal itself never shattered. Its legacy is woven into the fabric of our modern world, in the international laws that bind nations and the diplomatic courtesies that prevent conflict. We are the heirs of those first negotiators, still striving millennia later to build a world on the strength of promises kept. If this exploration of our diplomatic past resonated with you, please like and subscribe, and let us know in the comments which ancient practice you found most surprising.